I'm sure you have all heard that on the first Sunday of Advent we will begin using a new translation of the Mass prayers. Many of the prayers that we have been reciting since 1970 will be slightly changed. While remaining basically the same, they will have a different feel. They will seem a bit more complex in their structure and somewhat more formal in their approach to God. This is because the new translation follows the Latin original more closely than the current translation does. Well, you may ask, why do we need a new translation that follows the Latin original more closely than the current one? Especially if that makes it a little harder to recite the prayers and a little bit more difficult to comprehend it. We need an English translation that follows the Latin original as closely as possible to preserve the unity of the Roman Rite. Now, I fully realize that answer will not mean a lot to people who do not know that they are Roman Rite Catholics. I therefore am going to start by introduction of the new translation at the most basic level by saying that you and I are members of the Roman Rite. That is a fundamental part of our religious identity and a very valuable cultural heritage that we should be concerned to preserve. Rite, in the sense that we are using the word here, refers to a complex of ceremonies by which we worship God, celebrate the Eucharist, and administer the sacraments. There are more than one rite in the Catholic Church. In fact, there are many. Catholics in Eastern Europe follow the Byzantine Rite. Catholics in India follow the Syro-Malabar Rite. Catholics in Lebanon follow the Marianite Rite. Catholics in Egypt and Ethiopia follow the Coptic Rite. Most Catholics in Western Europe, North and South America, and Australia belong to the Roman Rite. The Mass, the sacraments, the divine office, and the other ceremonies of the Roman Rite follow the pattern of the papal liturgy. In other words, we celebrate the Mass and the other ceremonies of the Church in the same way that the Pope and the clergy of the city of Rome do. We do that by using the same liturgical books that they use. These books have, since Christianity came to Rome, been written in Latin. When the Second Vatican Council authorized the celebration of the liturgy in modern languages, it was presumed that each individual translation would faithfully reproduce the Latin original, so that every member of the Roman Rite, no matter in what language they worship, would be saying the same thing. That, unfortunately, did not happen. Translations made into the languages that have evolved from Latin remain fairly close to the original wording of the Missal. Translations made into languages that were unrelated to Latin introduced substantial changes into the text to make it eligible to their intended audiences. The English translation that we are currently using is one of those that vary markedly from the Latin original. That is because modern English is very different in both its structure and its style from the Latin language. For instance, Latin word endings change with the function that the word plays in a sentence. which makes word order relatively unimportant and favors the construction of long, elaborate sentences that are hard to translate into English. Translation into English is further complicated by the fact that the Latin of the Missal is not common, ordinary, spoken Latin. The prayers of the Missal are written in a high rhetorical style that was used by public speakers to sway their audiences with a display of linguistic prowess. At the time of the Second Vatican Council, there was a great deal of discussion about the best way to translate this kind of text into the various modern languages. Some held that the vernacular translations should match the high style of the Latin text. Others maintained that this would make them incomprehensible to the average person. They advocated translations that were perfectly grammatical, yet immediately intelligible to someone who dropped out of school after the 5th grade. Now, the reason that people talked about translating the text so as to be intelligible to someone who had only a 5th grade education was that the discussion was held in Italy. In former times in Italy, the Quinta Media, what we call the 5th grade, was the last year of compulsory education. That had changed years before the Council, but the expression remained as a common way to indicate that someone had only a rudimentary education. The basic idea being expressed was that the prayers of the Mass should be immediately intelligible to the common man. As egalitarian and popular as that idea was, it just didn't work. There is no way that you can translate the text of the Missal into that basic level of language without losing a lot of its content. Nonetheless, the International Committee on English and Liturgy followed that idea more closely than any of its Western counterparts and produced a very simplified translation. It is eminently readable, but farther from the original Latin than the Spanish, French, German, and Polish translation. Criticism of the current English translation began almost before it was published. People complained that it was impoverished and failed to convey the theological riches of the Latin original. Others complained that it had no merit as a work of English literature. It certainly was not up to the standards of T.S. Eliot or J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert Frost, or Carl Sandburg. It was at best clear, simple, textbook English. Numerous calls for a new, more faithful, and more inspiring translation of the Missal have been made both